All right, everybody, welcome back. Good to see everybody and to be with you guys virtually at least. Um, so let's just continue, everybody. This is our fifth lecture in the lecture series for ethics. And last time we started to jump into our first applied ethical topic of the course, which is the moral debate concerning abortion and whether it's morally permissible to terminate a pregnancy. So I basically talked to you guys about a lot of information concerning the topic, and then we covered the first author on the subject, that is Marianne Warren, and her classic paper from 1973 on the moral and legal status of abortion. I talked to you all about sort of the long history that goes into the topic, going way back into ancient times. We see written accounts of the concept of abortion and normative statements about whether it's right or wrong or permissible as far back as the works of ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle. We talked about how the Christian church's understanding and doctrine on the concept has also evolved over time. In the medieval period, in the 1300s, the official church doctrine was that the fetus could be aborted prior to the event known as ensoulment, but not afterwards. Of course, I mentioned also that they had this view that the male fetus achieves the soul earlier than the female fetus, 40 days as opposed to 90. But this archaic view was changed by the church in the late 1800s, at least in the Catholic Church, that is. I should be specific. When I was talking about 1300s, that's before the great events of the Protestant Reformation. So there was not yet this division between the Protestant branch and the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. But at any rate, the Catholic Church in the 1800s decided instead that it was conception that established the right to life of the fetus. So from that point onward, it was generally regarded as morally forbidden in all cases, in the church's view. In law, the legal ancestor of American jurisprudence was British common law, and they held the standard that quickening was the before and after kind of line in the sand, that quickening, which is the phenomenon when fetal movement can be detected by the mother, that only after this event would abortion be legally prohibited under the English common law. That was the original American standard in law, but the standards became more and more restrictive and strict until we get to the turn of the 1900s, the 20th century. And abortion was generally banned and restricted in all cases at that time in our country, unless for exceptional reasons like the life or health of the mother was at risk. But that all changed in 1973 with the landmark Roe versus Wade decision, which persisted obviously for almost 50 years until it was overturned last year under the Dobbs decision of the current Supreme Court. We talked about the case itself of Norma McCorvey, known as Jane Roe for a legal pseudonym, and her, taking it all the way to the Supreme Court and against Wade County, Texas, that was trying to prohibit her from having access to an abortion. Eventually, the court sided with her, and it was upheld numerous times after that, including in Casey versus Planned Parenthood in the early 90s. But it was overturned last year, so the federal standards are different now. What the court decided, though, under Roe versus Wade was that the Constitution provides a right to privacy that cannot be encroached on, at least with respect to a mother's decision about whether to continue her pregnancy up until the event known as viability. So that's another one of those kind of line in the sand distinctive events during pregnancy. Viability is the point at which the fetus could survive outside of the womb, at least in principle, by being hooked up to an incubator like a premature baby. And so the state believed that before that, maybe it doesn't yet have enough independence to be given the same kind of entitlement not to be aborted as it might have after that, phase of pregnancy. So some states under Roe versus Wade would, try to apply additional restrictions after viability, but not before. But anyway, we then talked about the article and the argument written by Marianne Warren. So I like to start the next class meetings with just brief summaries of what was before, so that there's continuity and all that. So I'm just saying to you about Marianne Warren's article that she's a pro-choice author. Her paper from 1973 called On the Moral and Legal Status of Abortion defends the moral permissibility of abortion. What she says in that is that her first question is, who are the members of the moral community? The moral community is a ethics term for the set of beings with full and equal rights. So that's the question: who are the set of beings with the classical Jeffersonian rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Certainly, me, you, and other adult human beings are members of the moral community. But we don't think that animals, for example, those that we would use for food, have the same exact rights that we do, at least not as strong or as equal as ours, because they don't. We don't think that they're obligated to be kept alive until the end of their natural lifespan, and so on, like we think with humans. So, what is the distinctive qualities or attributes that determine who or what is a member of the moral community? She says that a pro-life argument that's often given says that it's wrong to kill a fetus, and a fetus is a human being. Sorry, I meant to say it's wrong to kill an innocent human being, first premise, and then a fetus is an innocent human being, so therefore it's wrong to kill a fetus. This is a classic pro-life argument, but she says the problem is that it kind of equivocates on the meaning of the term human, switching between a more genetic sense of the term, meaning just having human DNA, versus the morally laden sense of the term, meaning a being that is a member of the moral community. And since the first premise, which says it's wrong to kill an innocent human being, is intended in the moral sense to avoid begging the question, and the second premise, which says that a fetus is an innocent human being, which is intended in the genetic sense to avoid begging the question, the two uses of the term in the first two premises there don't align, so the conclusion wouldn't follow from them. So then she says the real question remains: what is a member of the moral community? And she tries to articulate the attributes that she thinks constitute personhood by asking us to consider a thought experiment where we were trying to make a determination about whether alien life forms that we encountered on another planet were persons or not. Absent the fact that they don't have human DNA, what other things might you consider about them? Like, for example, she offers that they would have to be things that have got some form of consciousness and the ability to feel pain, that they would have to have reasoning or the ability to solve complex problems and use abstract thought, that they should have self-motivated activity, that means they could direct their own actions through their own will, the capacity to communicate, language, or the use of symbols to exchange information, and then self-awareness, the awareness that you even exist or that you're an individual distinct from other individuals. And so it seems as though those kind of criteria are what distinguish us from, say, like non-human animals and lower life forms. The fact that you can understand these words, or that you can read, or that you understand technology or other abstract ideas, or that you are at least self-aware and can feel things. Some constellation of these qualities amounts to the idea of a person, which she argues is the things that are the all and only members of the moral community. Now, that means that whether something had human DNA or not, if it had all these attributes, say it was a non-human alien with all those attributes, it should be endowed with the same basic rights that we have got. But if a thing has none of these attributes, and she's, of course, arguing that the fetus during the process of pregnancy doesn't have any of them, that in that case it wouldn't be a person, at least not yet in its current state, and therefore it would not yet have the membership in the moral community that entitles someone to have rights and full and equal rights, like, for example, the right to life or to not be killed. She knows that some people would disagree with the characterization by pushing on the idea that the fetus at least has the potential to be a person in the full course of time if it wasn't aborted. She tries her best to dispute against the potentiality objection, which says that the potential to be a person should be enough to give you the right to life. She pushes back against that with her last thought experiment about the captured space explorer. I was explaining that towards the tail end of the last lecture. Basically, the idea there that if a human being like you was captured by intelligent life forms on another planet, and they could transform each cell in your body into, say, 100,000 of them, then there would be 100,000 to 1 ratio of potential persons that your body could become when it comes to you and them. But she believes most people, shown this hypothetical, would think that you're still completely morally permitted to escape captivity in this case, meaning that you must place greater importance on the one right to life that you have against the 100,000 so-called rights to life that the potential people have. So weak or non-existent is the claim of a potential person's right to life when it comes into conflict with not just the right to life of an actual person, but she would go and say the bodily autonomy or liberty rights of an actual person also trump and dominate over the rights of whatever type that a potential person could possibly claim to have. And I finished the discussion by giving you a second version of her example, kind of my own creation, having to do with someone that was pregnant with 8 or 9 fetuses, and if it was a complex pregnancy that could pose a risk to the life of that mother. Many people at least might think that she was morally permitted to terminate all 9 or 8. And there again, it seems to show that since the numbers are so different, 1 to 8 or 1 to 9, there must be some kind of greater state of value or priority given to the rights, such as they are of the actual person rather than the potential one. So long story short, kind of bullet points. Mary Ann Warren says that if you have rights and full and equal rights, you have to be a person. A person is something that has those qualities like reason, communication, consciousness, self-awareness, self-motivated activity. The fetus, at least during pregnancy, doesn't have these qualities, or so it seems, and therefore it doesn't have these rights. So aborting it is not violating a right that a being has because it's not a member of the moral community. Maybe it's closer to the idea of, like, I don't know, killing a fish or killing a non-human animal that we don't regard as the same as an act of murder against an adult person. Okay, so with that, we continue today with our second lecture in this series of lectures on the topic of abortion. The author today is another pro-choice author, and then in the next couple meetings after this, we'll start to look at some of the pro-life authors and their literature. But one more pro-choice argument coming from a slightly different point of view, but to get to the same conclusion. This is written by a man named Michael Tooley. And this article is called, you know what, I'm gonna grab my textbook. I set it over here in the other room for just a second. Sorry, I have to step away for just one moment there. Anyway, Michael Tooley's article called In Defense of Abortion and Infanticide. Michael Tooley, in Defense of Abortion and Infanticide. Just get a little less glare there maybe, and that will help us see the board just slightly better. Let me see if I can find the date this was published. That's always good to know. It's in the 80s. I think it's like 1989, but I kind of forgot, and it's not listed so easy to find in the text. So 1 second as I try to look it up here. Yeah, 1988 is the original date of publication. So that's 35 years ago. Michael Tooley's paper. So with Michael Tooley's article, him in this article is kind of known in the field of ethics as perhaps the most radical pro-choice position that's out there, because as you might judge by the title, the author makes the argument that not only is abortion morally permitted at any stage of pregnancy, but he also goes further to say that in principle, at least theoretically, infanticide would be morally permitted, meaning the killing of the newborn infant rather than just the fetus, at least for some time period afterwards. The reason he says that is because, as he argues, the attribute that grants personhood or that constitutes having a right is absent both in all stages of pregnancy, but also in the immediate term after birth. So let's get into his article in greater detail. Now, one thing that is certain about this paper is that it definitely can evoke strong feelings of opposition to the argument, because it's quite visceral. The whole argument is being based around the moral permissibility of abortion full stop, and even some degree of moral justification offered for infanticide. So why even bring it up? And he mentions this. He says the reason that he tries to contend with that very difficult issue is because the advocate of pro-choice, he believes, has a hard time maintaining a consistent position without grappling with the issue. Because, right, if you were thinking about Mary Ann Warren's article, she argues that personhood is absent at all stages of pregnancy. But you might have wondered, the problem could be that how does this designation change with the event of birth? because the moral cutoff point at which the act becomes impermissible shouldn't just be arbitrary. It shouldn't just be like, here's a line in the sand that we institute for no moral reason, but just because it's a certain time point. So if you say that it's wrong to destroy a newborn, but not any stage of the developing fetus, then Tooley thinks you should have to point out a morally relevant difference between those two things, between a newborn infant and a late stage fetus in the womb. Michael Tooley says, and I think we could all agree, that killing a normal adult human being is murder, and that that's wrong. But he says we can identify a morally relevant difference between a fetus or an infant and full-on adult human beings like ourselves. Now, he does believe, as does Marianne Warren and other pro-choice advocates, that there are standard cutoff points of moderates are wrong, like quickening and viability. He does not believe that somehow quickening establishes a moral right to life, nor viability. So what condition or event or status does establish the right to life? He will attempt to say, and what he's going to try and show is that that quality or attribute is not present throughout pregnancy, and it doesn't even yet take full shape until sometime after birth. Now, he notes in his writing that the plausible positions on abortion are kind of extreme opposites. Because if the fetus has a right to life, then you would think that it's a human being with a right to life, so killing it is just as wrong as killing any other human being on par with murder. But if it has no right to life, as some have argued, as Marianne Warren and Tooley himself will argue, then why would it be wrong at all? Any more wrong than killing other non-human life forms for whatever purpose is deemed in the practical interest of a human person. So anyway, he will try then his best to state rationally what attribute or quality gives a being a right to life. And he thinks that that question and posing the question is theoretically interesting, and that grappling with it has both theoretical and practical value. Now he knows again, and he reminds the reader, that many people would react even to the thought of the theoretical possibility of morally permitted infanticide with visceral disgust. But Tooley kind of stands his ground on that, and he says, even if you felt disgusted, those are just emotions, and you have to have an argument, a rational argument to back your feelings, because simply feeling a certain type of way about someone's presentation of an argument or position isn't really making a counter argument or giving its own case. So he says, come to me with rational, counter arguments where you establish the reason that I'm wrong, but don't just say that it's like gross or something, or just disgusting or whatever. A visceral reaction is not the same thing as a logical counter argument. Okay, so anyway, we get into his notes. All right, guys, so here we go. We'll get started on some of his notes. He says the morality of abortion concerns the answer to 4 big questions. So here are 4 major questions that he poses to you. 4 major questions about abortion. Okay, so 1, what attributes, or he calls them properties. Properties is just like a more philosophically sounding term for what some people just call attributes. So, what property or properties, plural, either way, I'll just say it's singular, gives something a right to life? I'm just going to abbreviate that as an acronym, RTL, right to life. So that's one question. What feature or attribute, we'll call it property, what property gives something a right to life? What does it take to have that right? The second question is, does potential give something a right to life? That's the thing that Marianne Warren was contending with at the end of her article. Okay. Does just having the potential to have some kind of attribute in the future, is that sufficient by itself to give something a right to life? A second question that can be posed. A third question, if potential does not, if not number 2, does it at least make it seriously wrong to destroy this thing? If not, then does potential at least make it seriously wrong to destroy it? And so that's just asking, if potential didn't give something a full-blown right to live or a right to life, could we at least argue that it makes it, sorry, one extra word, seriously wrong? Does it at least make it seriously wrong to destroy it? Like, so maybe it doesn't have a right to not be destroyed, but doing so could still be called or counted as somehow wrong in a significant or serious way. And then finally, the fourth question that he gives to you is, at what point does it, in its development, does a human being first possess this attribute or property? At what point in its development does a human being first get this attribute that we're talking about in this series of questions? Acquire the property. Okay, so I know it's a little small there, but hopefully if you got a good enough viewing setup, you can see it, but I'll read them again anyway. Number one, what property gives something a right to life? Like, what thing or quality does something have to have that standing? And does potential, is potential enough, even if it doesn't have a property? Is potential of having the property enough to give it a right to life in advance of it having the property? The third, if it doesn't give it that right, if potential isn't enough, does it at least make it seriously wrong to destroy this thing? And then finally, number four, at what point in the process of its development does a human being first acquire this property? Because we know that we've got it by now. So the question is, at what point in our lifespan, or at what point in the timeline of events in life did we acquire it in the first place? Okay, so the first task that he takes on next, after having sort of set these questions up, is to try and tackle the first two. So we're going to definitely look at the sort of way he addresses the first one. What property, what attribute gives something a right to life? So to see what attributes could give something a right to life, take note that there are two different sorts of reasons why a thing may lack a given right. Okay, so since we've seen these questions and we've talked about them a little, I hope you've been able to take them in your notes. I'm going to erase that, and now we're going to create some room for some more information. So I'm going to write two questions here on the board, and just think about these questions with me and with everybody else for just a minute. Well, not two questions. I meant to say two claims. We did the question thing just now, but here are two claims. Okay, so first claim, a child does not have a right to smoke. Okay, one claim, child does not have a right to smoke. Simple enough to understand, pretty straightforward. But here's a second claim, and it says a newspaper, or let's say a piece of paper does not have a right to not be torn up. Okay, so the first one says a child does not have a right to smoke. The second says that a piece of paper doesn't have a right to not be torn up. Now, he asks a question to you about these two stated claims, these two claims. The question is, which one of these two claims is more obviously true? Like, which one is just more completely obvious to have no debate that could possibly be had about it? Like, no one would just deny or disagree with it. Now, look at them and think for a moment and just try to make that assessment. Which of these two questions would you say is just more totally obvious? That a child doesn't have a right to smoke, or that a piece of paper does not have a right to not be torn up? And if you're getting the vibe that this one is more obvious and more self-evident, then that's the case. That's the same thing that the author is pointing out. Now, whether you agree or disagree that a child does not have a right to smoke, that's something that people could debate. People could say, well, I don't know, when a person's 17 years old, or I guess in the state of California, it's actually been changed to 21. Some of you may even be under 21. Someone might be debating that. Well, the person can fight in war, so they should be able to smoke if it was the 18-year-old case. Or let's switch to the case mentioned here. A 17-year-old, they're already allowed to drive a car. They're allowed to see R-rated movies. They're almost adults. Why won't we let them smoke? So someone might argue that. I'm not saying I believe that. I definitely don't smoke and would never do that. But, someone might have those views, and that you can at least imagine a rational person, could disagree about it. But nobody could challenge and push back against this. For example, to deny this would be saying a piece of paper has every right to not be torn up. And I mean, clearly a piece of paper is not the sort of thing that has a right to anything. Just to make that sort of even more relatable. Here, this is just the tissue. I have a box over there that's sort of used to clear the board, as you guys have seen me do. So you can see here's a tissue, right? It's a piece of paper. And oh no, did I just violate its rights? Did it have a right to not have that done to it? I think you could agree, trash can over there. I think you can agree that that was not a violation of rights. It might have been a pointless act. It might have been something silly, like a waste of one tissue, and that's not a great thing to do in the general case. But no one can say that I violated the right of the tissue paper itself. And let's just kind of focus on the reasons why, even though I would hope that they're somewhat obvious, even just right at this stage. Because a piece of paper is not the sort of thing that is even eligible to have rights in the first place. There's something missing from objects that are like this. Then, on the other hand, objects like you and me that make it impossible for this thing to have rights. Now, obviously, in the case of this piece of paper, it's totally a non-sentient, it's an inanimate object. It has no ability to perceive. It has no consciousness. It can't feel or, experience anything. So clearly, there's nothing that could be done to it that could be a frustration to it, or that could be something that it did not want to have had happen to it. But now that gives us a basis to start thinking in more, critical ways about what feature is it missing, because it seems that there exists some kind of attribute such that a piece of paper lacks that attribute, and logically speaking, only things with that type of attribute can have rights. Okay, so let me write down the sort of summation of this little part of the article's, reasoning pattern. It's to get us to this intuition. Okay, so here I write it down. There is some property P. Now, property P, that's just a reference to whatever this attribute is that we're still kind of not yet sure of, but we know there is some such thing. So there is some property P such that pieces of paper lack that thing, P, and logically speaking, only beings with that kind of property could have rights. Okay, so what it says there is just sort of the principle that is supposed to be like the little moral of the preceding part of the argument. Thinking about it and just reflecting critically and using your own best judgment, I think you could agree that there's some kind of thing that this just doesn't have that's ruling it out of the moral community. There's some kind of feature, quality, attribute, call it what you will, call it a property, but there's something that a thing must have that this piece of paper and all other pieces of paper just don't have, that disqualifies them from having rights. And so our game now is to try and figure out what could that thing be that this has not got, but that you and I do have. So what might it be? Now we're ready to hear his suggestion, his affirmative claim about what it is. He says that it is the capacity to have interests. It is the capability of having interests. So having an interest in something is like wanting that thing, desiring that thing. If I have an interest in, a piece of pizza, that means that I want that, and I might take steps to acquire it. or if I have an interest in my education, like you might have an interest in your education, then that means that that's something that you care about and that you want to pursue. Um, so to have interests means that you have to have some kind of desires that you could form about other things. But if you don't have interests, then how could you possibly have rights? Because with no interests, there's nothing that could be done to a thing that would stand against those interests. So since there's nothing this piece of paper wants, and there's nothing that it's interested in, it's also not interested in not being torn apart. It's also not interested in not being set on fire, So like without interests, there's nothing that I could do against you. But if I have, like, say, an interest in my property, like, I have a nice cell phone here, I have an interest in maintaining possession of it. Since I have an interest in it, if you take it from me, you're violating my right to it, since it is something that I possess or that it's my property. Since I have an interest in, um, the relationships that I have with my friends and family, if those things were destroyed and someone did harm to those people, then that would frustrate my interests to perpetuate those relationships. So it's only if one wants something and they have interests in those things that denying those things or depriving someone of them could possibly violate them in a certain way. So this now becomes a principle that the author states formally to get us to understand his view a little bit better. So it's known as the interest principle. At least that's what he labels it in his article here. So I'm going to write it down. The interest principle says that in order to have rights, a being must be at least capable of having interests. So you got to be able to have interests to be even eligible to be a holder of rights. And in the bigger scope of his argument, maybe you can sort of anticipate where he's going to steer this thing. But having established this principle, which he thinks is just part of intuitive common sense, if it takes interests in order to have rights, then his argument is eventually going to try and establish that the fetus, throughout all stages of pregnancy, doesn't yet have any interests because it doesn't have any desires yet. There's nothing that it wants. Therefore, there's nothing that it wants to not happen. And in particular, we're not just talking about interests in general, but there's a specific interest that you'd have to have in order to have a right to life. So that is an interest in continued existence. So now the interest principle stated in this general form gets narrowed down to slightly farther into what he calls the particular interest principle. So I'm going to clear this first iteration of the principle with the more specific form that he issues just after that, after having discussed it and commented on it a little bit. We reveal the so-called particular interest principle. So the particular interest principle just says this in a more definite and a specific way. It says, logically, an entity can't have a right R So R just stands for whatever the right is a right to, and there are different types of rights, which I'll mention in a moment. But anyway, logically, an entity, a being, cannot have a right R unless it's at least capable of having an interest in R. Okay, so what it says is particular interest principle. Very similar to the regular interest principle, except now it's making a more specified reference to the individual right and what its content is. So it says, logically speaking, an entity cannot have some right R unless it is at least capable of having an interest in R. So to illustrate, let me give you a few examples, and then I'll move on to his own examples. But take the right to vote. Probably you and I can agree that, like, a dog does not have a right to vote. Not just because it's not established in the law, but like it wouldn't even make any logical sense to try and make an argument for a dog to have a right to vote. Why? Because, in order for it to have a right to that thing, it would at least have to be able to have an interest in the concept of voting. But a dog or a cat or any other non-linguistic, non-human creature or species could not possibly form an interest in voting because it would have to understand things that are conceptually beyond its abilities. Like, you would have to understand what a democracy is, or what the issue is that it's being asked to judge or to decide between. And for that, it would have to have language, and it would have to have, the idea of civic institutions and government. So not allowing dogs and cats to vote is not a violation of a right, because they don't have such rights, since they're not even able to have interests in them. There are other rights that people speak of in the human case that would not apply to non-human animals either. Like, what about a right to practice whatever religion that you want? This right doesn't apply to non-human animals because they could never have any interest in having a religion, since it would require them to think about things that, again, go beyond the scope of what their cognitive abilities are. So it makes no sense to say something has a right unless it was at least within the realm of possibility they could be interested in that thing. Now, the view of the author then is that in order for you to have a right to life, let's plug in life for the content of this right. So to have a right to life, something would at least have to be able to have an interest in continuing to exist. So that's the interest that he specifically thinks that the fetus and even some early stages of infancy don't yet have. Don't have this interest in continued existence because they don't have the ability to contemplate the idea of existing in the future. They're living in the moment and not thinking yet of the idea of the difference between being alive and being dead. So in his view, you'd have to have a fully formed concept of the life that you stand to lose and how it could be discontinued and how you don't want that to happen in order for you to first acquire the right to life. But only having attained such an interest in perpetuating your existence and not having it end, only at that time does the right come into form, because prior to that, the relevant interest doesn't yet exist. Now, he gives his own example to try and illustrate his thinking on this. So let me ask it to you as a question. What actually would be worse? Okay, I'm putting this one in the little chat then. So, by the way, when I say human, I mean like mature adult human, not the fetus. We're keeping that off to one side for the moment. So, what actually would be worse to do to a mature adult human being like you or I? A, tortured for 5 minutes, and then released, like let go. Or B, and B is just painlessly killed, like euthanized. So if it's a human being like me or you, these are both bad things to do. Obviously, we're not saying either one is good in its own right. But if you were talking about what's worse by degree, and you were forced to choose an option, probably most of you would say that painlessly being killed is a worse thing for a human adult to experience, or to be done to them anyway, than to be tortured for 5 minutes and then released. The reason for that is that, torture, as painful and brutal as it is, if it's only going to happen for 5 minutes, you still get to live at least, still get to continue your life after that little time period expires. But if you're painlessly killed, all your future hopes and dreams and aspirations for future experiences and so on, that all just be extinguished. So since we are attached to the idea of continuing to exist in the future, It is this painless euthanization that would be a worse moral act to be done against us. But now let me ask the question in a different context. What action would be worse to do to a cat? Okay, and so again, we have these two choices. Tortured for 5 minutes and then released. Or B, painlessly euthanized, painlessly killed. So think about those options. If it's a cat now instead of a human being, what's worse? And his view is that after reflecting on this for a moment or two, whatever, you'll come to this conclusion that it's worse with respect to the cat to take option A, to torture it for 5 minutes and then release it, as opposed to B, where it'd be, putting it to sleep, as it were. Now, why is that? What's the difference? Well, it has to do with the difference in terms of what interests you and I, adult human beings, could have or do have, versus the interests that a cat is capable of having. And it gets into this particular interest principle because, like, a cat doesn't have a full-on awareness of the continuation of the existence to its full lifespan. Humans like us, we're always living a little bit in the future, thinking about, the direction of our life and the things that we've not yet experienced that we'd like to yet do. So, you're in this class and you'd love to, I think, probably graduate college or to take on a career, or maybe some of you get married, have kids, watch your kids grow up, retire someday, own property, travel the world. So there's all these things that you have in mind about yourself doing, and that the hope and the desire, the interest in those things is something that matters to you. But non-human animals, without language and without the ability to think in the abstract, can't contemplate actively the future states of existence that they might experience. They're living in the moment, so they're, aware of some very limited time horizon around the things they're doing right now, like maybe to eat, to sleep, to play a little bit, in some cases, depending on the animal. But they can't be thinking, I really hope that I live out my full lifespan and I become an old senior citizen, cat or dog, and I really hope nothing gets in the way of that or, prevents that possibility. So we have a much greater attachment to the continuation of our existence because we know the distinction between existence and non-existence. We basically understand our own mortality because we're that intelligent. But animals, for better or worse, they're not burdened by the worry about their own mortality. They're not writing the existential poems and plays that human beings have written because they simply live. And death is something that they only have to consider, at the moment of death, perhaps, if at all. So painless euthanization with respect to a cat is the same thing as having it put to sleep at an animal shelter, which, as much as I love cats, and I have multiple cats myself, in a way I kind of wish he would have used a different example because of how lovable and endearing cats are. But his point is just the cognitive sophistication of non-human animals doesn't establish the same rights that they would have as opposed to us. So torturing a cat, though, does strike against things that it does have an active awareness and an interest in, because it doesn't take a higher level of cognition to understand that you're averse to pain and suffering, that you don't want to be exposed to pain and suffering. Animals obviously show aversive behavior to a painful stimuli, which means that they are definitely interested in a minimum and not experiencing pain and suffering in the present moment, but they're not contemplating, the deep issues of their own mortality. So to painlessly euthanize them, we don't think is inhumane, but torturing them certainly is. So what these distinctions point to, the fact that in the human being case, a mature adult human being, right, it's worse to kill than to torture for 5 minutes, establishes that it's because we have these interests in our continued existence, unlike, say, the cat, which is another living thing, sure, but in the case of it, a painless euthanization doesn't seem to most to be the same moral violation as to have tortured the animal for 5 minutes, even if it was going to continue to exist. Because whether in some objective sense it's better off continuing to exist than having been, euthanized or whatever, it's not that it is aware of what it stands to lose through the process of painless euthanization, and therefore it doesn't have interests that are being frustrated by the act. So the particular interest principle explains all his thinking on this. Cats and so on, they have some interest since they can feel pain. They have an interest in not being tortured, but have no active interest in the full-on perpetuation of their continuous existence. Now, one thing that is said in a lot of ethics writings is that rights and obligations are correlative. Okay, so let me put that point here. This is just a principle that is generally assumed in a lot of work within ethics, that rights and obligations are correlative. Correlative. Okay, so what that means is this. For every right, there is a corresponding or correlated set of obligations that all the other members of the moral community have to abide by the right and to not violate it. So to give you just a different example, I'll tell you, and I think we can all agree that I have a right to life. I'm certainly a mature adult human being, not a fetus, so I'm outside the scope of all these moral debates, as are you if you're watching this and hearing it. So with us, and let's just use me as the example, I have a right to life. And so since I have that right, what is the corresponding obligation that all the other members of the moral community have with respect to that right? Well, since it's a right I have to live, then you're all under an obligation, as well as everyone else in the moral community, to not kill me. Another example, I have a right to my property. So I have a property right to this phone, among other things. And so since I have a right to the phone, the corresponding obligation that matches to that right is the obligation that all others have not to steal it or to take it away without my permission. So it wouldn't make sense to say that we have rights if nobody was obligated to stand up and live by the rights. Now, are rights ever violated? Yes, of course. Sometimes people are killed, and all kinds of terrible things, tortured, raped, have their property taken from them, have their freedom taken from them when they didn't deserve it. I'm not saying that always happens, but it's something that can happen and has happened and continues to sometimes happen. So I'm not telling you that rights are never violated, but on the moral side of things, they ought not to be violated. And unless we were to be nihilistic and say there's no such thing as rights at all, then we do have to think that there's at least some moral obligations that exist, whether or not people always follow them in 100% of cases, to respect the rights. So anyway, rights and obligations are correlative. That means that if I have a right to something, and that I want that right to be honored, then everyone else is obligated to provide it. Now, the author gives a kind of long-winded technical explanation of his account of rights on page 166, which just matches what I'm talking to you about right now. Let me read this sort of complex statement that he gives about it, and then I'll try to sort of translate it for you. But on the left column of 166, he says, A has a right to X means this. Now, A is just a letter, which is supposed to be a symbol that stands for a given being, like a human being perhaps, or just any sort of being. But suppose that some being has a right to something X. This is what that means. A, the being, is such that it can be in A's interest to have X, and either, number one, A is not capable of making an informed and rational choice whether to grant others permission to deprive him of X, in which case, if it is in A's interest not to be deprived of X, then by this fact alone, others are under an obligation not to deprive A of X, or two, A is capable of making an informed and rational choice whether to grant others permission to deprive him of X, in which case the others are under an obligation not to deprive A of X, just in case A has not granted them permission to do so. So all that is saying is that if you have a right to something, it has to be such that it can be in your interest and that you have not waived the right. So even if you have a right to something, if you're rational and you can make a choice to set it aside, then that doesn't violate that same right. Suppose that I have a right to life, but I'm having a terminal illness and I request physician-assisted suicide, which is legal in our state of California, for certain terminally ill patients. Then when they, say, administer a drug or pull the plug from life support, as it were, that's not a violation of my right to life, because even if I have that right to not be killed, I've now given my own valid authorization to have that right denied or set aside. But in case you've not declined to have your right set aside, if it's something that's capable of being in your interest, then we ought to respect it. So the question then of the fetus and the question of the morality of abortion depends on whether the fetus is the sort of thing that is capable of having an interest in its continued existence. Is it capable of having that type of interest? And he says that all the evidence seems to indicate, anyways, that at least in its current state of development, prenatal development in the womb, just 9 months of gestation, and he's willing to say even sometime after that, but at least with attention to pregnancy, he would say it is not yet the type of being that has any interest in its own continuing existence. Because to have that interest, you must have the concept of being a subject of continuing mental states and desires. But the fetus, it has not yet even emerged out of the womb. So it doesn't yet have any kind of context as to what it is, as to what it wants, as to the fact that it's alive. And certainly it has not yet been able to ponder the difficult topic of its own mortality and its own susceptibility to dying. So, in early stages of the fetal development, it doesn't yet even have a fully developed consciousness. And it seems to him anyway that it's clear that throughout pregnancy, the fetus is not yet endowed with the ability of abstract thought and contemplation that it would take for it to be actively interested in not having its life end. So when is the right to life formed in the human course of existence? Well, he's not comfortable giving a specific date and time or point in time, but certainly it's at whatever point in time that a human being is capable of thinking about this kind of complex set of facts, that it's alive now, that will at some future time potentially no longer be alive, and it just does not want its current existence to stop. It wants that to continue and to continue indefinitely long. Now, at a certain point in time, little children that are growing up do think about their own mortality. And I've heard a lot of parents say that that's a difficult phase of their life when they start asking questions about, the end of life. But at any rate, throughout the fetal development, it doesn't yet have that interest because it doesn't yet have that concept. And he's willing to, hazard the view that even at some initial time after birth, the newborn is still not yet cognitively aware enough to focus on that thought yet either. Now, why would he say that at the earliest stages of infancy that thought or concept is also not present, the concept of continuing to exist and so on? Well, he says, if you think back in your own memory, you really don't seem to have any psychological connectedness to the earliest parts of your own life. Like, how far back do your earliest memories really go? In my case, they really only start to kind of form or take shape maybe around 5 years old. 4 years old maybe is a stretch, but I don't have a lot of stuff in my own head that I can retrieve from back that far. And so he thinks that, there's certainly a living being at that point in time, and they do have conscious states, but they're not yet the same subject of consciousness as the person that is developed after these important developmental phases take shape, because we can't have continuous memorial access to those phases of our earlier existence. And the behavior of the newborn also doesn't demonstrate any awareness of future states, really in general. As maybe some of you guys know, object permanence is not even yet present in the earliest life of an infant human being. So that if you show it something and it's like playing with it and then you just cover it up, it like cries because it thinks it doesn't exist anymore, which means that it can't process the mere thought that something maintains its existence when it's outside of view. So if that's the level of thinking that it has in the earliest stages of development, he's willing to say that it must not yet be able to apprehend the sophisticated and somewhat complex idea of its own liability to stop existing in the future. So to possess that interest in continued existence, you have to have the concept of a continuing subject of experience. And he just thinks that that's not something the fetus can say it has, or well, can't say it, but in general doesn't have. Now, page 168, he kind of lays out his full argument here. And, the argument that you'll see if you go to the textbook, it's quite lengthy, so I'm not going to write it all on the board or type it in the chat, but you can find it there for your own note-taking, and I'll just read it off. It's an argument with 4 premises that lead to the conclusion. And here's the stated premises. So first one says, the concept of a right is such that an individual cannot have a right at a given time to continue to exist unless the individual is such that it can be in its interest at that time to continue to exist. Okay, second premise. The continued existence of a subject of consciousness cannot be in that individual's interest at a given time unless either the individual has the desire at that time to continue to exist or that individual could have the desire at other times. So basically, he's saying you'd have to have this interest at a certain time in order to have the right at that time. And if you didn't have it at that time, it would at least have to be possible that you had it at other times. The third premise, an individual can't have a desire to continue to exist as a subject of consciousness unless it possesses the concept of continuing to exist. Number 4, an individual existing at one time cannot have desires at other times unless there is at least one time at which it possesses the concept of a continuing self or mental substance. So what he's basically saying there is that the fetus and the early stage infant have not yet developed this interest in the first place. Say someone that's an adult slips into a coma for a period of time, which they might recover and come back from. We might say that at that time while they're in the coma, they don't yet have this, they don't have that interest right now because their brain is kind of, unconscious, but they have had it at earlier times. And so they could still retain the right because the interest was at least at one time developed in their course of the timeline of their existence. But in the early stage fetus and infant, it hasn't even developed this interest in the first place yet. And so there's no time at which it has had that interest, and therefore no time yet at which it has had to get the relevant right. So his conclusion is an individual can't have a right to continue to exist unless there was at least one time when it possessed the concept of continuing to exist. Okay, so beneath the elaborate sophistication of his argument and the many different points that he makes, he's getting to, I think, something that can be stated fairly simply, which is that if the fetus is destroyed before birth, certainly, then it has not yet approached the point in time where it would have an active and a self-aware interest in continuing to exist. It basically doesn't know any better yet as to what the discontinuation of life means or consists in. Not unlike the acts taken against animals in many cases, which in a similar sense are to end their lives, but we think since they're not actively contemplating what it means for their lives to have ended, then it doesn't stand against interests that they were actually possessed of. So he will say then, as I'm mentioning, that fetuses and even newborns don't yet have that concept, and therefore don't yet possess the right to life. Now he knows that some people will raise religious reasons to object to this, maybe saying that the fetus has a soul from the very first instant of conception, and even if it can't articulate itself until some significant time delay later, the soul is the criteria on which something has a right to life. But he doesn't find this to be a very convincing argument because, as he points out, that depends on only one particular religious, presupposition. Not all religions affirm the same concept of the soul. Not all of them say that it is present at the earliest moment of conception, and many people don't even hold religious views. He also mentions that in a pluralistic society like ours, that's not sort of a theocratic society, we shouldn't play favorites and put greater weight on one or another religious interpretation about the doctrine of when we have rights, or when we are persons, or when we have, the right to life. So the last thing that he basically has to contend with at the final part of his paper is the same sort of hurdle that Marianne Warren faced at the tail end of hers, which is the question, even if it's, as they argue, if suppose someone was conceding the point that it was wrong to destroy something that had this active awareness of continuing to exist and had an interest in that. What about something that just has the potential to have that interest later? Doesn't potential establish by itself, that it's seriously wrong or even a violation of rights to kill something that will have a potential to later on have this self-aware interest in continuing to exist? So this is kind of like tackling that third question that was written on the board earlier. Does potential to have this property of having an interest in your continued existence, does that alone establish a right to life? So this is, again, the potentiality objection, and I just want to kind of make sure that that's something we don't forget, because this is the most powerful sort of pro-life response to a lot of this information. So an objection, by the way, is just a reason to disagree with something that's been presented by another, reasonable person. Like if I have an objection to my opponent's argument, then that means that I have some rational basis to disagree with what they've said. Like suppose that someone made an argument to me that God exists because the universe has to have a cause. And then I say, well, I'm not so sure because here's an objection. If everything has to have a cause, then wouldn't God have to have one? And so, in a way, you're contradicting yourself. I'm not. So, just as an example of like another argument where someone could raise an objection, in law, you've always probably heard the term used in courts, like objection, Your Honor, because in this practical legal context, one lawyer, whether it's prosecutor or defense, is trying to object maybe to the conduct of the other person, but that's a different meaning than it's used in the academic context. In the academic context, it's just like a rational basis to disagree with someone else. So the potentiality objection to the pro-choice view of, say, Warren or now Tooley, it's this. Let me put it differently, actually. I'll put it in his terminology. Potential to have an interest in continued existence is enough to have a right to life. Okay, so like, suppose that you follow Tooley's argument. You're looking at Michael Tooley's argument. And you're like, okay, I can sort of see where he's coming from. He makes the case that at least throughout pregnancy, maybe even some period after, but at least let's focus on pregnancy. The fetus doesn't yet have this interest in continued existence. So, terminating the pregnancy doesn't remove or violate a right that the being has, because in order to have this right, we have to have an interest. But you might say, but look, even if I follow that logic, why should it have to have an interest now? Just the potential of having that kind of specific interest in the future should be sufficient for it to have a right to life now. And you could say that's a big difference, perhaps, between, like, say, the cat example and the fetus that's being compared with it. Because the cat that's being euthanized is an animal that does not have the potential to ever have these more complex, sophisticated thoughts about mortality and the distinction or the contrast between existing on the one hand and then not existing on the other hand. But a fetus, by contrast with the so-called cat or dog, pig, cow, whatever, the fetus is, yes, perhaps currently unaware of its status as a living thing and that the fact that it could someday not exist any longer. But if you provide it enough time, of course, it's going to develop just as we have, and then it will have all kinds of, interesting thoughts about that prospect of its non-existence. So shouldn't the potential be sufficient by itself? Why does the potential have to already have been met in the advance of the full development of these interests? Why shouldn't it already have that relevant right? Sorry. So it's an interesting thing. He says that there's kind of an asymmetry between the pro-life and the pro-choice advocate on this point, because the pro-life person doesn't really have to say what attribute gives something a right to life and when that attribute is acquired. All they have to say is that by the time they're a mature adult, they've definitely got the attribute, and the potential to have it in the outset is enough to do all the work. On the other hand, the pro-choice person is burdened with having to say exactly what the attribute is and maybe even when it is fully acquired, because otherwise it would be like they were saying, abortion is permissible, but we can't tell you why, and we can't tell you what the fetus doesn't have, which would not seem morally supported. So in other words, the potentiality principle is key to the pro-life case, because all they have to say, once again, on the pro-life side is, I don't know really what makes something be a person or be a member of the moral community, but reasoning backwards, we know that we are. And so at all earlier developmental stages, we always had the potential to have whatever the property was. So I'm not burdened by an obligation, says the pro-lifer, to give an account of this attribute or when it's established. All I have to say is that we've got it, and potentiality does the rest. It allows those to avoid articulating what the relevant property is, because it's, again, enough to say or know that adult human beings have it, and just having that potential from day one should fill in the rest of the gaps. The pro-choice person, on the other hand, has to give an account of what this attribute is to have any kind of defensible position. So Tooley thinks that without the potentiality principle, the pro-life position is significantly weakened. So he attacks the potentiality principle, the claim, again, that's lying at the heart of this objection, that potential to have whatever attribute should be enough to have a right to life already. Now, I got to tell you, the example that he gives to try and show why this principle is wrong is admittedly a little bit odd. It's not necessarily one of the strongest examples, I would say, just because of how bizarre it is. But we've already talked about Mary Ann Warren and her odd hypotheticals involving, wondering whether space life forms were persons or not. And it's just a constant feature and theme throughout a lot of philosophical writing and work to raise thought experiments, hypothetical scenarios, call them what you will, not for the purpose that they be realistic, but just so that we can focus the mind on specific aspects of the presentation of an argument and the logic of the argument. So this hypothetical used by Tooley is supposed to try and show why potentiality does not itself establish any right to life. So I'm going to draw some stuff on the board because this is one that requires almost a little bit of pictorial description. So this, let's say, is a cat. Now, I'm not, doing an amazing job drawing it, right? But there's our kitty, okay? Now, this cat, one thing about it is we got to imagine a world where there's a chemical. Okay, so this is a syringe. And inside of this syringe, there's this chemical, and what it is it's a personhood drug. Okay, this thing is a personhood drug. Now, here's why it's called that, and here's what it does. If you inject this so-called personhood drug into like a cat, here's the effect that it has on it. It transforms that cat slowly over time into a person like you or me. Not saying a human being, okay? It's not going to transform into a genetic human being. It's still going to look just like a cat does physiologically, and it will still have all the DNA of a cat. But it's going to develop in the way of being a person, like how Mary Ann Warren talked about. So it'll be rational. It'll have language. It will be self-aware. It will have consciousness, and it will have self-motivated activity. So, like, on day one, this cat sitting here is just playing with yarn and, like, eating kibble and stuff. You give it this injection and say, like, I don't know how much time it takes. A couple years down the road, you come home, cat's reading the New York Times, like, hey, what's up? You want to watch like something on TV, or like, should we just chill? Anyway, it's like a person, like a human person. The only difference being that it has the presentation and appearance of a cat. So anyway, that's what this hypothetical drug does in our little thought experiment. It's a personhood drug. Give it to the cat. What does it do? Turns it slowly but surely into something like you or I, an intelligent, advanced being that we can call a person. Now, imagine we have two kittens, or cats. He uses kitten as his example, once again. I wish that he used maybe a less pleasant creature, but that's fine. So now we have two of them. I want you to imagine that this one was injected with this drug, but it hasn't yet taken effect. It's very slow to take effect. So it's just in the very earliest stages after the injection was delivered. This other cat has not been injected at all. Now, there's another drug now, second drug to mention. So that's called the neutralizer. So let's say that's the neutralizer drug. Now, here's what our so-called neutralizer drug does. Based on the name, maybe you can guess. The neutralizer drug neutralizes the effect of the personhood drug. So it completely stops and immediately reverses any effect that this drug had on the specimen that it was introduced into. So, like, if you gave this personhood drug to the cat, it's like starting the process of making progress towards being a person. But if you want to stop that in its tracks and just bring it back to being a regular type cat, you would give it the neutralizer just after then. Okay, so now, imagine that we give this cat a neutralizer drug. We give this cat the personhood drug. And then right afterwards, we hit it with the neutralizer, so it's back to the same kind of status as its twin. Now, if we were to say painlessly euthanize the regular cat, his argument is that because this is post-neutralization, so it's back to being a normal cat itself, then the moral status would be the same on both sides. So if this was morally permissible to painlessly euthanize a regular cat, it would also be morally permissible to painlessly euthanize the cat that had been first given the personhood drug, but then quickly neutralized with the second drug. Because, it returns it to its original condition, this drug. Now, here's our little twist. What any of you guys watching, is perhaps a more straightforward way to stop the forward progress of the personhood drug taking effect without having to supply the cat with a neutralizer? Well, to simply kill it. And that would also achieve the same result as having done two steps, first neutralizing, then euthanizing. So if you don't see any significant moral difference between those two actions, inducing personhood on it, neutralizing it, then euthanizing, versus inducing personhood and then just euthanizing it in one step rather than in two, then you must be conceding to this point, he says. You must be thinking in terms of your intuition that it is not significantly wrong to arrest the progress towards personhood in a being by killing it before that progress has been achieved, because you're thinking that if the cat hasn't yet really made much progress in terms of the effect of this drug, then killing it to stop the progress from continuing forward is just as valid and morally permitted as having, randomly given it the neutralizer first and then euthanized it second. Now, I know, having taught this so many times and thought about it on my own, that I feel in a way there's a slight weakness with the use of this example by the author, and for some reasons he could probably relate to. For one, I think it's so, outlandish, which is typically not necessarily a problem with the content of a thought experiment. But in this case, I feel that it's slightly problematic only because you may have a hard time deriving intuitions from it that you could then apply back to the real case of abortion. You might say, well, I don't know how well I can extend these thought experiments to the realistic case because they're so far different from what we would have in reality. But I think he's prepared for that takeaway. And here's what he says in the last part of his essay. So if you think, though, that it remains wrong to kill the cat that has been given the personhood drug if it has not yet been neutralized and returned to the status of a regular cat, if that's your feeling, then he says you're kind of committed to something that is implausible when you think about what it means or implies. That means that you're saying that anything with the mere potential to one day have personhood, it's wrong to destroy it at any earlier stage. But if that's what you really feel, think about how human gametes, like the egg cell in a woman, is a thing that also has the potential to one day become a full-on person if it's fertilized right by a male sperm cell. Now, most people don't believe that contraceptive methods are in themselves morally impermissible. Like a person will use a spermicidal lubricant on a condom, or they will take birth control pills, which stops the ovulation process in the egg that's normally deposited. So the point then is that if you find those to be morally permissible, you do realize that some gamete cells are destroyed by means of those contraceptive methods, which you could argue destroys or eliminates something that has at least the very potential to one day be a full member of the moral community, or being that has an interest in its continued existence, or say a person, however you want to characterize that. So on pain of saying that even contraceptive methods are impermissible, you must not really feel too strongly about the idea that destroying something with the potential to have a membership in the moral community later is wrong before that potential has been established. So I feel like that's maybe a little bit of a better part two to the example. I mean, the example does have its own intuitive force, and you may follow his logic on it. But if you deny what he's saying, then he kind of challenges you this way. Well, if you think that anything with potential to be a person or be a member of the moral community has full-on rights, like the right to life, then what do you say about common contraceptive methods that are widely used? You must not really feel that's so wrong. And if you don't, then you don't have consistency with the principle that all things with potential to be a person are endowed with full-on rights or the right to life. So his final word then is his summary that he gives on page 172. And I'll just read that before closing the stream for the moment. And here's what he says. So here are his three main conclusions. Number one, a being cannot have a right to life unless it is capable of having an interest in its own continued existence. 2, an entity is not capable of having an interest in its own continued existence unless it possesses at some time the concept of continuing to exist. And 3, the fact that an entity will, if not destroyed, come to have properties that would give it a right to life does not in itself make it seriously wrong to destroy it before it acquires those properties. And so that's his little rejoinder to the potentiality concern there at the very end. All right, everybody. So that's what I have, for this one installment. Stay tuned because the next one, episode 6, starts to talk about some of the pro-life other side of this debate, and that's something that you'll see as we go throughout the whole course. There's always going to be a balance where we examine arguments on either side of the big, interesting moral controversies and issues. So we will next take a look at Don Marquis, who I kind of find to be maybe the best or one of the best to articulate the pro-life position in the debate. So we'll look at him next, and then for the Thursday meeting this week, we have 2 final authors on the topic of abortion. That's John Noonan, another pro-life author like Don Marquis will be, and then we have one last pro-choice author. That's Judith Jarvis Thompson and her paper called A Defense of Abortion, which is also considered a classic and very important paper. So just 3 more total lectures on this before we move on to our next subject next week. But for now then, guys, thanks so much. I really appreciate all your time and attention on the class. If you need anything, please contact me anytime you need to. But for now, take it easy. I've distributed the paper prompts, by the way, but I would say you probably can hold off on working on them until you hear some more of these lectures, because you want to at least maybe have the option of writing on Thompson, and she's something that we'll talk about in lectures to be delivered later this week. So at any rate, have a good one. Thanks again. And this is Dr. Village signing off. Thanks.